Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The clone troopers had a lot of things going against them when it came to long-term survival. Sure, they were physically and mentally superior to the average human being, but the situations they were put into during the Clone Wars demanded far more than even their Fett DNA could provide. They were constantly outnumbered by a massive separatist droid army led by Jedi generals with little to no combat experience, and unlike most soldiers, they had no combat tours or rotations off the battlefield, no R&R. The fighting was constant and never-ending. And so they were oftentimes too busy to think about the future, which was a good thing because what was the plan? After a clone became too old or too injured to fight, what would happen to them? It was one thing for the Republic Senate to approve emergency funding to support the Republic in the midst of a civil war that threatened the core worlds. But now, even with Palpatine's federal takeover of the banking clans, the Republic barely had enough money to replace all the battlefield casualties, let alone make sure the clones were acclimated back into normal society and given enough financial support to start a new life after the military. There are also dark rumors that clones that were too injured to fight were basically just put down. There are also even more darker rumors that those put down clones were turned into protein bars, but I can't substantiate those rumors. To make matters worse, all the Fett clones had their DNA modified so they aged twice the normal speed of the average human being, allowing them to mature to combat age much faster, but at the same time, cut their lifespan in half. This meant that the first batch of clones to enter combat on Geonosis were around 18 years old, and by the time the Battle of Yavin, almost 22 years later, the oldest clones would be physically the age of 62 years old, while the last batch of clones made during the fall of the Republic would be around 58 years old. So if you take all of these factors into account, you can imagine just how rare it was to see a clone still fighting for the Empire during the Galactic Civil War. But there were cases, and they were quite hard to find, but we did find 3. Around 0 BBY, a small garrison unit of stormtroopers were stationed on the desert planet of Tatooine at the Mos Eisley spaceport. This was an unimportant Outer Rim world and generally unremarkable aside from the fact that it was on the border of Imperial and Hutt space. The Empire had some dealings with the Hutt cartels over the years and tolerated their presence in exchange for certain favors. Alvin Squadron was just going about their normal everyday business around the Mos Eisley spaceport when the Devastator Imperial-class Star Destroyer caught up with the Tantive over Tatooine. The Corellian corvette had been carrying secret plans for the Death Star that had been stolen during the Battle of Scarif by partisans. Alvin's squadron was deployed along with the rest of the Imperial garrison across the planet to search for escape pods that had left the Tantive 4 shortly after it was captured by the Empire. Designated Foot Patrol 7, one squad was searching for rebel droids around the downtown area of Mos Eisley. Craig was the oldest member of the squad and a clone trooper who often told stories about the transition of the Republic to the Empire. Despite the fact that Craig was still a buck private after so many decades of service, most of the other troopers in the squad listened to every word he said, and that's because he had a lot more combat experience. And against real enemies, not a bunch of angry citizens with hunting blasters. Foot Patrol 7 would later that day encounter Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke Skywalker, and the droids the Empire were looking for, but were completely fooled by the old Jedi's mind tricks and let them go. Cragger would once again miss Obi-Wan Kenobi just seconds after they leave Han Solo and Chewbacca's table in the Mos Eisley Cantina, and once again as the Millennium Falcon takes off under Stormtrooper fire. Despite the fact that everyone he once knew was now dead and that he had no real future, Cragger was still very dedicated to his job. He was exactly the type of clone that the Kaminoans had envisioned when they first started making the clone troopers. It's unknown exactly why the clones were phased out by Emperor Palpatine, but it was said that Palpatine viewed Order 66 as a wake-up call that the clones were too easy to manipulate. After all, Order 66 was a part of a larger catalog of contingency orders, several of which could have been used to remove him out of office as well. Others say that the cloning program was far more expensive to maintain compared to the Stormtrooper program, which was just recruited from the citizenry. And even though the cloning program was ended by Palpatine, it doesn't mean that he did not appreciate their individual skill and loyalty. which is why at one point in time during the Galactic Civil War, the captain of his Royal Guard was actually an unnamed clone. You see, prior to Palpatine becoming the Chancellor, the executive office was protected mainly by the Senate Guard and Senate Commandos, a non-clone unit that was sort of like the Secret Service. But after Senate Commando leader Captain Argus betrayed the Republic by setting free a Trade Federation war criminal, Palpatine began replacing the Senate Commandos with his own Royal Guards. Now, it's unknown where this clone came from exactly, the one serving in Emperor Palpatine's Royal Guard, but it's very possible that he had served in the Coruscant Guard prior to this. This was an elite clone shock trooper unit that was said to have been bred and trained separately from the other clones. These clone shock troopers seem to be a lot more disciplined and loyal and less individualistic than the rank-and-file clone, which is why it seems that Palpatine used them on some of his more sensitive and secretive missions, like retrieving Anakin's burnt body from Mustafar or framing the clone Trooper 5s, who had figured out the control chip conspiracy. The clone captain of the Royal Guard would accompany Vader and Emperor Palpatine on a routine inspection to the world of Ryloth. Cham Syndulla's resistance was causing headaches for the local Imperial garrison. En route to the planet, the Emperor's Star Destroyers ambushed and destroyed by the Bolt Twi'leks, and the Emperor and Vader, along with the clone captain, must find a way to survive in the hostile wilderness of Ryloth. The whole time there, they're being chased by enormous packs of monstrous insects and rebel fighters. Now, immediately after the crash, the clone captain shows just how loyal and obedient he is to Emperor Palpatine when the Emperor has him execute one of the Royal Guards who's only injured his legs and fully capable of recovering. Throughout their entire ordeal on Ryloth, the clone captain somehow was able to keep up with the two Sith Lords, something that would be hard for any non-Force sensitive to do, let alone a clone that was probably nearing 60 years in age. In a moment of respite, the Emperor has the clone captain take his helmet off. This is all a part of the games he likes to play with Anakin. Upon seeing the clone trooper, Vader is reminded of his past life, something that he's still having trouble letting go. Seeing another Fett clone, he immediately thought of Rex, Cody, Fives, and Echo. Ultimately, the clone captain died in a swarm of lilacs while trying his best to follow the Emperor's orders, showing that his conditioning and discipline were superior to most other clones. Lastly, we have Sergeant Crest, a veteran of the Clone Wars and eventually the head of a stormtrooper contingent in charge of keeping Darth Vader and Tarkin safe on a mission to the planet of Murkana. While on the mission, Sergeant Crest and his men were in charge of guarding Tarkin's personal ship, the Carrion Spike. Although it was just a Corvette, the Carrion Spike represented one of the most precious pieces of technology the Empire had available. Modeled after the Republic prototype stealth ship used by Anakin Skywalker against Admiral Trench during the Clone Wars, the Carrion Spike had the ability to cloak itself not only from active scanners, but also the naked eye. Vader was extremely angry about the theft of the ship and even casually threatened Sergeant Crest by saying that maybe he was too old and aging too quickly. Crest, however, manages to rebound from his mistake and ultimately gets promoted to the rank of lieutenant by Vader and would join him on several missions during the earlier years of the Galactic Civil War. Even though the clones were eventually decommissioned by the Empire, that only meant that new ones were not being trained. The clones played an important role in training and leading the first batches of clone stormtroopers. Although most clones, like Commander Cody, were frustrated by the quality of these new troopers, their loyalty to the newly created Empire was steadfast, and they would try their best to carry on the clone trooper legacy by training this new generation of stormtroopers. And so in the decades in between the Clone Wars and Galactic Civil War, the clones that remained served as NCOs and junior officers and provided the proper buffer zone until the newly created Stormtrooper Corps had their own veterans who could eventually take over. It's for this reason that clones were generally held in high regard in the Empire despite their advanced age, especially for individuals who have fought alongside of them or at least seen or heard of them in combat. There are some things you can't really train a full-grown adult to do. The clones were bred for war and taught from the womb how to fight a war. And that's what really separates the clones from the stormtroopers, and that's what also allowed some clone troopers to fight way into their 60s with men about a third of their age. Well guys, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.